Welcome to another Gloo tutorial. In this video, we will demonstrate how to use Gloo's Interactor to visually modify elements on the page, using them to make live visual changes on our site, all from the front end. Ready to see how it's done? Let's get into it. To understand what we will be building here, let's take a look at this dashboard that I have made. Here are a few details. We have the name, we have the age, we have the profile picture, we have the best color, and we have a cover image. Let's try to change these elements on the page visually. Let's start with the display name. Hard to spy? Nah, easy to spy. Works? Correct. Let's try the custom cover image. Choose. Use this one. Open. Let's wait for it to upload. Does it work? Yes, it does. Let's try the display picture. Choose files. Handsome man. Open. Does it work? Yes, it does. Preferred color. Let's use gray. Works. Let's use light yellow for the other color. It does work. Let's change the display age to 20. Works? Yes, as you can see here. Once we're done, we hit submit, and that's it. Now, how did we achieve this? Let's take a look at the dashboard and we'll find out. It's a regular Elementor template, 2 sections, inner sections, widgets, the regular stuff. Now, we need something to be the store of value, something to store the name, the age, the picture, the color, all of this good stuff, you know. For this purpose, we installed Jet Engine, which we use to create the meta boxes. Whatever you need to use to create your meta box and your meta fields, use it. Cool. Now that we have something to store our values, we need something to carry the values from the front end into these meta fields. And for this purpose, we're using Jet Engine Forms. Use whatever you want, even if you want to use Elementor Forms, especially if you're taking advantage of our Gloo functionality, which helps you use Elementor Forms to create custom data that can be stored in the meta fields. But for now, we're using Jet Engine Forms. Let's take a look at it. We've created a form to edit user details. After creating the form, we added the user ID as a hidden field because we need that, of course, to update the user, because that will be mapped to the user ID, as you can see here. If you're familiar with Jet Engine Forms, this is how it works. Now let's take a look at some few important details that we'll be needing for this process. We created the form with a custom display name, and this is a text field. A custom cover image, which is a media field. Only that we ensured that we made it attached as a URL. We've chosen the file types that are allowed, and we have given it a class of cover image upload. Please take note of that, and we'll come back to it later. Apply changes. We did the same thing for the other media field, which is the custom cover image media field. This, we've made it any registered user, attachment as a URL, and we've identified the file types that are allowed, and we've given it a class of cover image upload. Apply changes. Good. Now, here is preferred color. We have the submit button, and that's it. Once we're done, we update it, and that is it. Now let's go into the Gloo dashboard. We'll start by giving all the sections IDs. The first section, we'll call it first section. How about that? Cool. The second section, we'll call it second section. Second section. Ah, beautiful. I still know how to spell. We have this inner section and we have this other inner section. Recall that at the beginning of this, we changed the color of this inner section. So let's give this inner section here an ID. Let's call it inner section for intersection for color. Next, we want to ensure that each of the fields are assigned to the meta fields associated with them. I think everything's set up. We hit update, we come to the front end, we refresh this and see if it now shows what we need it to show. Yes, it does. So this is the regular setup, meaning anytime anyone comes into the user field and changes any of the details here, it'll update here. But if we bring in the form, there it is. And now it's fetching all those details that we updated in the back end. Let's update that. Now let's go to the front end and let's refresh this. Cool. Now, notice that if we change this to hard spy, nothing changes. And that is because we have not applied the full extent of the interactor. Let's do that now. To make Gloo work with this, there are certain things we need to understand about how this works. For each of these fields, the custom display name, the preferred color, the display picture, the cover image, everything else, all of the fields, each field has an ID. But how do you find it? Right click, inspect, click, come here, and look through this. So we have input, there's the class, there is this, there is that, and here we have the ID. The ID is custom display name, as you can see here. So if we right click and copy, let's paste it here just to be sure. Does it remind you of anything? Yes, it does. It reminds me of the fact that this was the exact same name we gave to this field. Custom display name. Let's go into the forms and check it out. Click here, custom display name. That's the name. Meaning that every field you create, as far as you gave it a name, that name becomes the ID. You see the small icon right here? That's Gloo turned on. Of course, you need to install the Gloo plugin and ensure that you have turned on the module that allows you to do this. It's called the Interactor Engine, as you can see right here. Let's go back in. Now, with Interactor, it is possible to create a set of triggers and events. Think of triggers as causes. Think of events as results. Now, if I do this, I want this to happen. Does that give you an idea of what we want to achieve? If I change here, this input field, I need this to change. Now let's make that happen with Interactor. Let's click on it. Only that will start with doing the events. And the reason is that whenever we create a trigger, we'll need to select the events that it'll fire. So now that we don't have events, let's start by creating the event. Let's close this out. Come to events, click here, event title. What do we call this? Let's say change display name. Good. Now, there are a ton of events that can happen. There are animations, there are interactions, there are emulations, but for this purpose, we need interactions. And what interaction? Scroll down. Here is set text. Select that. Set text. This text. Easy as spy. So, let's select easy as spy. Come into advanced and give it an ID. Let's call it easy. S I. Let's come to Interactor, select it again, and say what is the target? What are we setting the text to? Straight up, we understand it is to easy spy. Only that this time, we'd have to add the hash symbol just before the easy spy. Of course, as you can see here, is an ID, a class, or HTML element. Use commas to separate multiple selectors. But for this is the selector because it's an ID. If it's a class, we use a dot. Since it's an ID, we're using a hash symbol. The target relation should be default. Now, the first parameter should be the form field. Whatever we put in this form field, we need it to be replaced here. So what will it be? So we'd say fetch that from a form field. What form field? Remember, we right-clicked on this, we inspected it, we copied the custom display name as the ID of this form field. Remember? Cool. Now let's copy that. Let's come back in here and fetch it from that form field. Let's put a hash and put custom display name. All good, all cool. We're done setting the event that this should change at the instance of changing this particular form field. This should change. Now, what should the trigger be? Let's call this display name input. That's a trigger. The firing event, we want that to be input change. Because of course, we're going to be changing the input of this form field. Remember, this is an input. Now, do we want it to fire once only? In other words, when we change it once, we don't want it to change again. Nah, we want it to change as many times as anyone feels like changing this. So let's leave it turned off. Now, what is the target? The same input, custom display name. That's the form field ID, remember? And if we feel fancy about it, we can put input just before it. Just to be sure that this is what it's targeting. It's targeting the input and it's targeting the ID of custom display name. Click on this, select the event to fire and choose change display name. Once we're done with that, we'll come to the front end and see if it's working now. Let's close this out. Let's refresh the page so it can pick up our new settings and then we'll try it out. Easy as pie. Let's change it to hard as pie. Hard as pie. As you can see, that update here right away. Awesome. We'll repeat the same process for age. Let's do it now. For the age, let's not bore you by repeating the process entirely again. Let's simply select the age widget here. Give it a CSS ID of age of mine. As you can see, click on this glue icon here. Click on the event. Change the age, which I have created. I've made it an interaction. Set text. I've targeted age of mine, which was the ID that I gave to this widget. As you remember, that's what we're targeting. And then we need to fetch the parameter from a form field. So we take this as yes. And then what's the form field? Display age. How do we know? Because display age is the name of that form field. Remember how we worked on the first one? Yes, you did. Awesome. Now, once we have that set up, we'd come here to set the trigger. The trigger would be display age and display the age upon input change. Once I change the input or the form field, that's what it means, then run the event, on this target. The target is the form field. Once that is done, we'd save it. So I've already done, and I'll refresh this just to see if it works. So I refresh this, change this to 35, 45, and as you can see, that changes. Now that's done. Next, let's work on the cover image. Select the section, come to advanced, copy the CSS ID, come back into Interactor, add a new event, give the event a name of something like change cover image, and then we'll set the event to interaction. Interaction is set CSS. The ID will be the ID we just copied, first section, and then we need to set two parameters, the first and the second. The first parameter will be the first part of the CSS rule, which is background image. The second parameter would be what we fetch from the form field. So we toggle that on and then we'll set this to image wrapped in URL. Let's confirm that for a minute. Let's come in here, let's right click here, let's click on inspect, and then we can see the two parameters here the first one, background image, and the second one, this. Only that we will not be setting this, but we will be fetching this from the form field. So we've toggled this on, we've selected image wrapped in URL because of course that's the way it's presented here, and then we're going to set the parameter 2, which will follow this form. Input, open bracket, name equal to, quotation open, and then we'll paste in the ID of this form field. So let's copy that here and paste it here and close this out. Once that is done, we'll set a little delay just so we can give it some time for the DOM to input the image and then for that change to be reflected here. So let's just add a 5 millisecond delay. Now let's come back into Interactor, click on add item, give this a name, say cover image change, and then set the firing event to element inserted in the DOM because of course when an image is uploaded to a web page, it is inserted in the DOM and it is not a simple input change. So select element inserted in the DOM. Once that is done, let's come back into the form field and remember that we set a custom class here. Just to be sure that we're targeting this specific field, we're going to copy the class. Now we'll add dot and paste that class name there. Once that is done, there is one other selector we need to find, which is the selector of the form after the image is uploaded to the DOM, right here. So let us right click and click on inspect. Once that is done, we see this image tag harbors this link right here. The div harbors this image tag. So let's just go one step up, click on that, click on this small icon here to select new style rule, and then we'll copy the selector right here. Let's come back into the Gloo dashboard and select this interactor rule and paste that selector right there. Once that is pasted, that is done. Let's select the event to fire, change cover image. Let's close that out and update this. Now that the page is updated, let's refresh this front end and see what happens here. Let's choose a cover image. This one, open. Now, as you can see, it updates here. Cool. Let us work on the profile picture right now. Once we come into Interactor, we'll set a new event. Let's call it change display, change picture. Let's just call it change pic and then put src in brackets. We'll talk about that soon. Let's set the event to interactions and the interaction to set prop, because of course it's not set CSS. This is a change of a HTML element and not a change of a CSS background image as we did before. Now the target would be the target of this specific image. So let's go back to the front end. Let's right click on the image and then come here, select this small plus button here, and would see the selector. So let's copy that and come in here and paste that in, and now we're targeting this. Once that is done, the first parameter, as we can see right here in the inspector, is src, which is the path to this particular image. So let's type src in here, and that is done. The second part of the parameter, we need to fetch that from the form field. So let's toggle this next one on and toggle on fetch image from input, and then we'll set it to raw and remove double quotes because of course we don't need it to be this, it's not a CSS background image. Once that is done, parameter 2 will do what we did before. We'll type in input, open bracket, we'll say name equal to, quotation open, we'll paste in the ID of this particular form field, which in this case is custom display picture. So we'll paste it in here, we'll close the quotation and close the bracket. And then we'll just give it a delay of 5 milliseconds just to give the DOM some time to take in the image before that changes. Once that is done, we'll close that out and we're done with the source. We'll add one more event. This time we're changing the source set. Change pic src set, which is the source set as you can see right here. So let's come back in here, set the image to interaction, the interaction to set prop, and then we'll target the same thing which we targeted before, and then would come back here to the first parameter and type in src set. The second part of the parameter will fetch that from the form field as we did before. We'll say fetch image from input rather, and then we'd select raw and remove double quotes. Fetch parameter 2, same thing we did before. So let's just go in here and copy this thing right into this one. So we paste it here. Once that is done, we'll give it a delay of 5 milliseconds just so we can give the DOM some time to take in the image. As usual, let's put in, so we can now catch those events in the triggers. So let's type in the new trigger and just call the trigger change profile image. And then we'll say the firing event would be element inserted in the DOM as usual. We'll leave it to toggle off, fire once to toggle off, and then target would be, of course, the same thing we did before when we worked on the input change. Remember, only this time we're going to set the target of this particular CSS field. Remember, so we'd copy it here, the CSS class, we paste it in here, only we'll put a dot before it because it's CSS, and then we'd come in here, scroll down, right click on display picture, would inspect it. This is the image element, the div harboring it is this. Would click on this one, would copy the selector right here, and then would come back in here, and after putting in a space, would paste it right there. The event to fire would fire both events, the change peak source and the change peak source set. Once that is done, we'll click update, and we are done. Let's refresh it at the front end and see what happens. We'll first close this out and refresh. Change display picture. Let's choose this beautiful lady right here and see what happens now. That works. Excellent. Now, let's work on the final two parts of this dashboard. We need to change the background color of this inner section and the background color of this second section right here. Let's start with the inner section. Remember, we give it an ID, so let's copy that ID. Let's come back into Interactor and create a new event. This we will call change best color. The event will be in an interaction. The interaction will be set CSS because of course now we need to change the background color. So we'll paste in the target as of course that target for this intersection, and then we'll come down to first parameter and type in background color. Of course that's the first part of the CSS rule. The second part we're fetching from the form field, and this time we are going to leave it as is. For the image output, just leave it as is. For the fetch parameter 2, we need to fetch it from the exact form field. So let's come back into the form. Remember, this is preferred color, which is the ID of that particular form field, and then we'll paste that ID in here. Once that is done, we are done. Let's close that out. Now, just so we can fasten this up, we're going to select the second section, copy the ID, and work on it right away. Let's come back into Interactor and also say change back color. Best color, back color. Cool. Event, interaction, the interaction, set CSS. What is the target? The ID of the section. Once that's done, the first part of the parameter, background color. The second part we'll fetch from the form field. We'll leave everything else as is. We'll select the parameter 2, and then we'll put in the ID of that particular form field. Let's apply changes to this and select the other preferred color, which is where we're fetching the other color from. We'll copy this ID, come back in here to this fetch parameter 2, we'll put in the pound symbol and paste in that ID right there. Once we have that, we're done with creating the events for the change of this color and this color. Now, let's create the trigger. So select the first trigger and say change best color. Fire an event, come down here and say input change, and the target would be, of course, the ID of the field which would harbor the preferred color. So we'd select that as the ID, and then would select this to change best color, which is of course the preferred color, right? That is the field there to change this. Once that's done, we need to create the same thing for the other background color, and then we'll just give it a name as usual. We could just call it change black color, the firing event, input change. The target will be, of course, the field or the preferred color. Let's put a pound symbol before it because it's an ID, and then we're going to set this to change back color. And once all of that is done, we'll hit update, and we're done with the magic of Interactor and Gloo and the changing of elements on the page without refreshing it. Let's refresh this so we can just test it out. Preferred color, black. That changed. Of course, just to be sure, you can use any HTML element right here, any HTML color code right here, which is, of course, this one, for example. And if you click on this, you see that's the color for black. You can change it to something else just to be sure. And as you can see, that also changed here. If you want to change the other preferred color, let's change this to white smoke, which is about my best color for background color. And once you hit that, you see that changed automatically. The display age, let's change it for the font of it, and as you can see, that changed here. Once we're done, we hit submit, and that is done. Thank you for watching this tutorial. If you want to see more of the power of Gloo's Interactor, we've talked more about it in separate videos, so be sure to head over to gloo.ooo to check them out. Help more people to see this by hitting the like button. If you want to see more of this magic in the future, do subscribe, and we'll see you soon. Bye for now.